Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for your patience. I'm Doris Zonner, the host and moderator for today, and it's really great to see so many of you joining us. I have a couple of wonderful panelists, John Alfuth, who's the Senior Director in State Policy from KnowledgeWorks, and Dr. Kip Rogers, who's the Chief Academic Officer from the Virginia Beach City Public Schools. We are going to meet the panelists. So we are joined today by John Alfuth, Senior Director of State Policy with KnowledgeWorks, and Dr. Kip Rogers, the Chief Academic Officer for Virginia Beach City Public Schools. Welcome to you both. And would you just share a little bit about yourselves and your background before we get started? John, you want to go first?
Thanks, Doris. Making sure everyone can hear me. My name is John Elfuth, and I am the Senior Director, as Doris mentioned, State Policy at KnowledgeWorks. We are a Cincinnati-based, nationally operating nonprofit that focuses on helping schools, districts, states, and federal policymakers re-envision what's possible when it comes to learning, and really with a focus on what we call personalized competency-based learning, which you'll hear a bit more about today. A little bit of my brief bio is I've also worked on policy at the state level, at the National Governors Association, at the federal level, at the Department of Education, and in Congress. And then I started my career as a high school math teacher. So shout out to all of the math-related folks that we may have on the call.
Yay, math. Thank you, John. Dr. Rogers.
I'm excited to be here. I'm Kip Rogers. I'm the Chief Academic Officer in Virginia Beach City Public Schools, where we educate almost 68,000 students, and I'm just excited to be a part of this conversation. This is my 31st year in public education. I've had the opportunity to serve students at every level, elementary, middle, and high school, in the building as a principal, and about 15, 16 years in the central office level. So I'm excited to have this conversation.
Thank you so much.
Certainly.
And welcome. And I'm Doris Zonner, the Chief Academic Officer at CAE. And I specialize in critical thinking and higher order skills of students using performance-based assessments. So before we get started, Diane, if you wouldn't mind running the poll for us. So the learning objectives for this session will be for everyone to understand the common challenges and solutions to move from vision to practice for Portrait of a Graduate, how to use innovative performance-based assessments to improve outcomes, and then to learn a little bit from a Virginia school district's journey in this. So it's a very, very high level in terms of what Portrait of a Graduate is. It's a document that outlines a shared community vision of the characteristics a student should have after going through the education system. And that considers things like hopes and dreams and aspirations for the community, the skills and mindsets children need for success, the implications of the design of the learning experiences, and equitable access to those experiences. So this is accomplished through bringing together diverse perspectives from the broader community, not just educators, but students, elected officials, community members, families, to help build a unifying collective vision for students. As a background, we were looking at 6 through 12 in terms of Portrait of a Graduate programs, and we found over 126 schools and districts within the United States, which are available to over 733,000 students that are looking at Portrait of a Graduate programs within their districts or states. So just curious a little bit more about you. We want to learn more about you, if you wouldn't mind. What is your current role in education, and just seeing who we're working with today? So lots of teachers, and if you are in the other, be really happy to know what you are in terms of putting that into chat. Academic coach, board member from a school board member, professional development. Excellent, excellent. Nice to see a diverse audience. Lots of coaches and counselors. Okay. And what about how many of you, if we can close this poll and run the next one, does your school or district participate in a Portrait of a Graduate? Looks like the no's are winning. 60-40 no and 60 no, 40 yes. Interesting. And then the next question we have, in your opinion, Which of the following higher order skills, which are skills not that are outside of content area, do you think are most important for your students to master? You can pick one, which is the most important. You can think all of them are important, but what is the most that you should focus on, you think, for this? Communication, followed by creative problem solving, and then collaboration, and if you think citizenship. Great, thank you. So the first part of this discussion really is about policy. So why are these portrait of a graduate skills important? And if you wanted to operationalize this to pursue a competency-based education environment, what are some considerations? So John, I'm going to put that question out to you first.
So one thing I just wanted to flag at the outset is that I mentioned KnowledgeWorks operates nationally. We support schools, districts, states, and federal policymakers. So we really cover the whole range of folks that engage with education, both policy and practice. Now, our team, the team I work on, we focus on policy and advocacy because so much of what schools and districts can do, as I'm sure everyone on this call has experienced, is dictated by state and in some cases federal policy when it comes to adopting innovative education approaches like a portrait or competence-based education. So we, and we mean I also, often work hand in glove with our staff to support schools to help create these types of policy environments, as well as help translate policy into practice. So my area of expertise primarily focuses at the state and federal policy level. That's where a lot of my comments are going to focus here today, but happy to try to answer questions that may drill down a bit more to the state or school or district policy as well. First, before jumping directly into the why portrait, I think it is important for a little framing. So, I think the reality that many of us will acknowledge, hopefully most of us, is that the traditional education systems and structures that we have they don't work for too many of our students. And this isn't something that's new. This was a system that was designed for sameness, but not for personalization. It moves students through the same content at the same pace, at age-defined grade bands, and sorts them by ability level. Now, this isn't, again, meeting the needs of students in today's world, even by conventional measures. While we're seeing graduation rates at near record highs, we're also seeing other indicators that are telling us that we aren't necessarily preparing students for what comes next. You see millions of students that are graduating, getting that stamp of approval with a diploma, but they're heading to college and needing to take remedial coursework. We're also seeing employers, for example, increasingly tell us that they can't find job candidates with the soft skills like critical thinking, teamwork, or problem solving to be successful. We're also seeing increasing shifts, especially since the pandemic, in public opinion as to what parents, students, and communities really want out of their system. You're seeing things like confidence in public schools being at an all-time low. You're seeing parents and students saying that they want schools to better prepare their students to build good lives in their communities. You're seeing parents and students that are asking for more real-world skill building. And last but not least, 3 in 4 parents in one survey noted that they think a lack of personalization is a big problem. So our K-12, again, policy and structures at this district, the state, and the federal level have really been built up to entrench this system. And as anyone who's ever tried to change a system knows, it is hard work and it's challenging. So before you can change that 100-year-old system, you need to have a vision for what that alternative system can and should look like. And that's where the portrait of a graduate piece comes in. So as Doris shared in her deck, the portrait is that shared learning community vision. We really think of it as the North Star by which education systems can start to reorient themselves around a more personalized and competency-based approach to education. 4 kind of key points that we often refer to as, from our experience, why the portrait. It helps unify the community's commitment towards a common purpose and an alternative and a new and forward-thinking vision for education. It really ensures ownership when it's created collectively through the collective decision-making process and accountability. It empowers everyone involved to clarify their role in helping meet the needs of each learner. And last but not least, it allows for alignment and coherence of that system. So portraits really, in our experience, allow us to create an alternative vision that's based around a transformative set of outcomes for our students. And I really want to emphasize before I go on the importance of this co-created piece in the why the portrait. It really has to include students, parents, educators, businesses, post-secondary education, anyone that's going to be involved in that that ownership and those role pieces. So, we've seen this, and I can allude to it a bit later with some more information, but there are 15 states as of right now that have adopted a portrait across the country. One that we work with a lot and often like to point to for this kind of co-created model is South Carolina. They really identified that this statewide portrait was something that they needed. And when developing it, they include a very broad range of stakeholders, which they really credit to the successful acceptance across the state of that. So in closing, I know I talked a little bit about states here. I'll talk a bit more about states. Portraits can be state or, as Doris highlighted, locally community developed. Doesn't have to be one or the other, but for all the reasons I've articulated here, I think that's the why behind why we really see the need for this portrait approach.
Mm-hmm. So if you wanted to operationalize this, what are some policy considerations?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think operationalize in a competency-based environment, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is kind of
Yes,
the crux.
yes.
Yeah. So thinking about a competency-based environment, I just want to do a quick framing because I know a lot of different places use different terms. So I'm going to use competency-based education just as a blanket term here to refer to a lot of different things that are very similar and in some cases are synonymous. So you might hear it referred to as mastery-based learning, personalized learning, student-centered learning, proficiency-based learning. Just know that not to minimize any differences between these, today I'm just going to use competence-based education to generally refer to all of these things. So just want to clarify that before moving on. So first, just want to also clarify what we mean by personalized competence-based learning. So this is a definition created by the Aurora Institute with the input of stakeholders from across the country, and it contains 7 parts. Really, competence-based education promotes learner agency, includes assessments that are timely and help lead to action, gives learners the customized supports they need to be successful. It builds progression based on mastery instead of seat time. It allows for flexibility in learning pathways to demonstrate mastery, incorporates strategies and systems to ensure equity, and includes both rigorous academic and social emotional learning targets. So this is all about making sure that, in a traditional system, oftentimes you'll see students move on whether they get an A or a B or a C, which is indicative of how much they may or may not have learned. The goal in a competence-based system is everybody is moving on once they have learned the material, but that everyone does learn the material. So the constant is the learning rather than the time, which is the flip of how we usually have it. So with that in mind, there are a lot of policies that really feed into this. And just for some context, we have a 12-part state policy framework on our website, which includes everything from student learning pathways to assessment accountability and state funding systems. So as you can imagine, when you're trying to operationalize a portrait, you pretty much have to engage with the whole gamut of different systems that are encoded in state and federal policy. So here are a few of the typically higher profile ones that we often highlight. So again, a number of steps once you've created the portrait that naturally flow from that. And this is true whether it's a state level portrait or a locally created portrait. The next step that we will typically advise communities to do is in a competency environment is to create a set of competencies that align with the portrait. So competencies express the most critical learning outcomes that learners need to thrive in a changing world. And they typically focus on outcomes that will extend beyond the graduation day. Things like effective communicators or being critical thinkers. And these are then articulated how a student will make progress towards those in cross-disciplinary groups that span different grade levels. You might see grades K through 2 or 3 through 5, and then how a student would make progress towards that competency across those different grade bands. We also like to define these as guaranteed and viable, meaning that they are co-constructed with learning communities and learners are given equitable opportunities to really engage with them in meaningful and relevant ways. So once you've created these competencies, then schools and districts have to engage with a number of other systems that, depending on what state you live in, may impact your ability to move forward with additional implementation steps. So to address this, many states have created pathways that allow schools and districts to adopt innovative education approaches. These can be things like innovation zones, pilot programs, or waiver opportunities. So if you're a school or district looking to operationalize these, you're not sure if you have the flexibility to do that, that could be an appropriate avenue for you to take a next step down. One example, we work in North Dakota. They have an innovative education waiver. They have several school districts that have taken advantage of it and are already starting, even after only a few years, to start implementing personalized competency-based approaches. Schools and districts also need the implementation resources, including whether they are written down in terms of guidance, financial resources. Some states have implemented grant programs or human capital structures to help with teacher professional development and training that can really help educators understand and operationalize how you put those competencies in the portrait into practice. Next, you really need to think about graduation requirements. Does your state is it set up in a way that you can meet graduation requirements through mastery or through different types of learning experiences? And does this help you make progress towards that vision in a portrait? Educator preparation and training, I think alluded it to a bit in the resources, but thinking about how do we make sure that our teachers understand what these structures look like, and it's not just another initiative that is going to come and is going to go. I know I've been through my fair share in time, but it's something that is really here and is important and vital for teachers to engage with. Seat time can also be a big barrier, especially if it's very narrowly defined within the constraints of how many hours a student is spending within the walls of a classroom, which is oftentimes tied to things like funding and can potentially have impacts on schools, again, if that seat time definition is more narrowly focused. And then last, but certainly not least, there is the assessment and accountability system. Those required under ESSA, as well as those that states may have added on top of that, that really drive many education decisions for better or for worse. So these are all things that need to be considered and addressed when thinking about implementing and scaling competence-based education. So just a quick kind of snapshot, and I thought it might be helpful. I know that we have folks on from all across the country to give you an idea of beyond just the local portrait level, what are things looking like at the state level. So a really quick run through. About 10 years ago, 2012, this is the snapshot of states that had some of these policies to support competence-based education in place. Fast forward about 10 years, and you have almost every single state that has policies in place to really facilitate the growth of this type of learning experience. And this is 3 years ago. I also want to make sure to note for any Wyoming folks in the call that Wyoming is also taking some steps in this way. So this is technically all 50 states. We just haven't updated the graphic yet. The last piece I wanted to highlight here on the spotlight part is that we've seen about at least 15 states that have developed a portrait, and at least one more. Wyoming currently has it under development, at least as of last time that we checked. So you can see here on this last slide, again, large numbers of states breaking down those graphics a bit more. You have 15 states with state level competencies. You have 25 states that allow grad requirements that can be satisfied through student-centered assessments. You have, again, 18 states that focus on competency determinations for graduation requirements. You have 31 states with innovation zones. You have 18 states with pilot programs and 44 states with waiver opportunities. And then 17 states provide some kind of grant funding to build capacity for student-centered instruction. And last but not least, 13 states that have allowed alternative instructional time models to address that seat time requirement. So chances are, regardless of where you're living, you live in a state that has some of these structures in place and have hopefully set you up to start exploring how might you go about implementing some of these practices built off of a portrait.
Thanks, John. Really interesting and informative. If anyone has any questions for John, please make sure you put them into the question piece. But before we talk about how we can measure, so we have these skills, how would you measure this? In your opinion, which of the following, this is a poll question for the group, which of the following higher order skills is the most important for students to master? Summative assessments. Okay, that's interesting. Thank you. What's interesting about summative assessments is that if these are higher order skills, they're not necessarily being measured on these summative assessments, since those tend to focus on ELA, content-based things like ELA, math, science, and social studies. Let's look at this poll question. If you're teaching your students higher order skills, how are you doing so? Digital portfolio, I'm seeing that in the chat. Embedding this in coursework is very popular. Really interesting. Most people, the large majority of respondents are saying that you're embedding this multiple modes. Thank you from Ann Larson. Co-designing learning experiences. Thank you for sharing. Project-based learning. Yes, so that's embedding coursework. Cool. Thank you. And close this poll. So, in terms of assessment, why do we need to measure these skills? I mean, states, districts have developed, as John said, and is it enough? And we don't think so. So, why do we need to measure these skills? So, higher order skills are really important because the research that my colleagues and I at CAE have done show that those students who perform better on our assessment that measures critical thinking have better outcomes both academically and in their careers. So they have higher cumulative GPAs at their end of the senior year. So this is all tied to higher education outcomes. That's predominantly where my research is focused. And they also are associated with more positive post university outcomes as measured by employment, salary, graduate school enrollment, as well as the ratings by their employers or hiring managers. So, how likely are they to get a raise, and how likely are they to have a good performance review? So, we know that these skills are important, and yet they're seldom reported specifically on transcripts. So, there is a way, though, that we can measure these skills that's it's not necessarily on a summative state based end of year assessment, but can be done in a different way. So we at CA use performance-based assessments, and this is a way in which we can measure students' skills by having them respond to different prompts where they're put into a real-world scenario, they are asked to provide a recommendation, and just like in the real world, there's not a single right answer. So if you think about, for example, critical thinking, there's not a single way to think critically. There are lots of different ways in which a student can showcase and demonstrate critical thinking, and there are multiple solutions that might correct. So this is a way that allows us to measure students' skills rather than whether they can recall or identify a correct answer on a multiple choice exam, like in a summative assessment. So one of the questions that we often get is how do we incorporate these skills into an already packed schedule? Like you have all this stuff that you're trying to get through in the school year in terms of your curriculum. We looked at how much embedding of these skills are in, from the poll question we just had before, how much of it is embedded. The idea is that you don't necessarily have to have a test. You could embed this as a performance task or project-based learning or co-designing learning experiences or et cetera, like what the attendees are saying. And so many of you are already doing this in practice, but we just wanted to call out specifically that you don't necessarily have to have a high stakes end of year summative assessment in order to measure these skills because these are skills, right? And it's not just content knowledge. And we want to introduce the idea that there are creative and innovative ways to do that. Thanks for the comment, Jackie. Yeah, so any questions about assessment, happy to talk about it further, but I want to give our other panelist, Dr. Rogers, an opportunity, given that we started a little late and also have enough time for questions. So I'm going to ask just one more set of polling questions in terms of, so given what we just talked about, in terms of challenge, like putting this into practice, what would be the greatest challenge for you in terms of implementing this program? Teacher buy-in is a big one. So there's a question from Kimberly about alternative innovative ways. If you wouldn't mind putting that into the question and answer box, and we can get to that in a minute. I can talk more about that. Teacher and administrator buy-in, yeah, we find that to be the case as well. Time, available class time, and time to create the materials. Yeah, good point. So I'm going to then now ask Dr. Rogers to tell us about the Virginia Beach City Public School program. Why did you do this work? And what was the goal of the program overall?
Well, thank you. I'm so excited to be here and looking forward to speaking to the group briefly about the work that we've been doing in Virginia Beach relative to the graduate profile. And just so that the group knows, the graduate profile is directly aligned to our strategic planning efforts. And we began actually this work, you'll see at the bottom right-hand corner of the slide, Compass to 2020 that was actually started in 2014-15 school year. So we work in 5-year increments, as do many different school divisions. But in any event, Compass to 2025, which is where we are now, is our 5-year strategic plan. And each year we've developed a strategic action agenda in order to guide the work that's within the context of that multi-year plan. And we generally focus on 3 big things. And the main purpose is to engage students, parents, and all staff in ensuring that our students are ready for the future, or future ready as we refer to it. And in order to prepare them, we do utilize the graduate profile to guide that work. And when I think about the what people should know about our graduate profile, there are 3 things that generally come to mind. The first of which is to make sure that people understand that this is a direct outgrowth of stakeholder input. And I'll put in the chat a link to a virtual town hall that we use to as a means to generate and get information from our stakeholders. That, in addition to um, some face-to-face meetings, but we had a lot of input from our stakeholders, teachers, students, administrators, members of the community, parents. And the second piece is that it articulates what the attributes we like to have students to have in order to be future ready. And there are 8 of them that are there. And the third piece is that it's more than just a pretty poster, a pretty piece of, a pretty document, but it actually is used to help guide positive about who they are and what they can achieve. So I'll go into a little bit of the why to answer your question more specifically, Doris. And did I miss? Yeah, there we are. All right. So generally, why is focused around everything that you've already heard so far this afternoon. But you may be familiar with the fact that the state of Virginia, and we alluded to several states that have them, also developed the profile of the Virginia graduate. And the interesting thing about that is we developed ours first in Virginia Beach, and I will say that. The content does overlap, as you can see in the graphic. But ours was designed to be more student friendly, a student friendly version that fits actually with our core values, one of which is putting students first, and then our emphasis on building student agency. Um, the broader context of the graduate profile speaks to our work of building skills that are needed, and that, again, that comes directly from our stakeholders. It also focuses on the importance of learning how to learn as opposed to what you learn, and emphasis on that. And then the last critical bullet talks about the beliefs becoming an actual reality for students. And I'm sure we can all relate to that, where someone saw something in you or you saw something in a student that you didn't know was there until their belief shaped your belief. So the heart of the work is about expectations as well as hope, and the expectations we hold for others and expectations that we hold for ourselves. So I want to take a closer look at the graduate profile, and actually I'll put a link to our actual graduate profile also in the chat so you can have a look at it at your leisure. And Doris, I'm not sure whether you have everyone's contact information, but I'm happy to share these documents with you so that the participants can have access to it later. So I'll just touch on it briefly. We've done a full court press since 2018 in order to be able to answer the big question: what would it mean for students, schools, and our community if all of our graduates had all of these 8 attributes? And we've done a lot of hard work around, of course, 5Cs and PBIS and SEL, and developing student agency and personalized learning to make sure that we have the necessary supports that are in place to move our graduate profile from an aspirational document to something that's living and an actual reality for our students as well as our staff. And honestly, when the profile was initially developed, we didn't have a working definition of personalized learning. So that took some time. And there was no conversation around this idea of transformational learning dispositions and the interplay that collaborate between leadership and teachers and students in the learning environment and the community. And well, in the way on how do we measure the attributes of the graduate profile, and especially my favorite, orange slice, and that talks about resilient learners or this idea of teaching kids grit. How do you measure that? How do you
Hmm.
measure that? So those are one of the things that we grapple with. So what we did to move from vision to actual practice, and I wish I could have my camera on because I have swag to show you all how we live and breathe this idea of the graduate profile. So we focus on identifying the systems, practices, and processes that support the work or not. And then we spent time reflecting on how do we provide access and opportunity for our students. So one of the first conversations that we had with our building level leaders and our teachers, we just simply asked them to consider specific instances where you've observed the 8 attributes that are in our graduate profile in action at their schools or in their classroom or at home, and then reflect on the ways in which they're providing you're providing your students with actual learning experiences as well as the opportunities that help them to acquire those attributes. And what we found was there were gaps. So we expanded upon those ideas and providing experiences and opportunities to support the profile. And then we talked and we still plan, quite honestly, for equity and access to the opportunities that we were providing. And the ways in which we make that happen. We spoke with students with regards to thinking about how does this happen. And actually, they had trouble in identifying the learning experiences that supported the graduate profile, but they also expressed concern that some of the best experiences that they had were not something that every student had access to. Then we ask ourselves, well, what do we need to happen in classrooms and in schools if we're going to have students internalizing these 8 attributes? And then what do students need to do, see, hear in order for them to be able to internalize those attributes? And the graduate profile helps us with that. And one big document that really helps us with shaping that is our strategy map. And I'll put that link too so you can kind of get a sense of it. And I know we don't have a whole lot of time. And I can talk about this all afternoon. I really can because of the work that we've done. But we have a strategy map that guides our work. And in a nutshell, we work on 4 big things: working on rigorous, relevant, and real world learning experiences. That's the first. And then the second one is this idea of curated works of substance. So this is where that assessment piece comes in. So you're not doing traditional rote multiple choice assessments. And that's where we have the opportunity to begin measuring the attributes that are associated with the profile. And we use Google Drive in order to curate those works of substance and providing students the opportunity to share that work. And then the third piece is creating a meaningful plan for post-secondary pursuits. And that's through our academic and career planning that actually takes place in grades K through 12. And then the last piece is creating a signature experience that is often generated through things like passion projects or work-based learning experiences. So the kids have an opportunity to demonstrate the pieces of the graduate profile that we want them to have access to. And then those 4 areas are grounded in equity, SEL, and then of course innovation, and some really tangible things that have come into play this past year that I want to just share is we adjusted our master schedule at the high school level to make sure that kids have opportunities to be innovative and to do some creative things with their schedule. So we went to a 4x4 schedule, which was we don't have enough time to talk about that process, but it's working well, especially going into the second semester. We spent a lot of time this year talking about working on curated works of substance to replace final assessments at the end of the year in order to create a shared learning and understanding experience. And then our signature learning experiences at the elementary level have gone really well. So those are just some of the things that we've been doing to address some of the issues that have come up relative to actualizing the graduate profile, and it's a work in progress continually. So I'm happy to answer any questions, and I know me talking kind of fast, but I want to have enough time to allow the participants to ask us questions. And I'm
Well,
happy to
I actually,
send link to
Uh,
the schedule.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Rogers. I actually have another question for you, if you wouldn't mind sharing. What are some of the surprises that came up as you were implementing this? Like, what can you share?
Well, I don't know whether it was necessarily a surprise, but one of the things that we continue to grapple with, and even like today, is if we want students to have or curate these works of substance so that projects become the learning or not and are not taking place at the end of the learning. How do you make that happen, and how do you measure these attributes? Like, how do you measure that a kid is
Mm,
resilient? And I keep going back to the orange slides. How do you measure that? How do you measure if a kid is cross-culturally competent? Not a kid, a student. How do you measure that? How do you measure if a student is being a great thinker or an inquirer? So um, those are surprises. We thought it would be easy, but it's not.
mm,
It's tough. It's challenging to really measure that. And what we found was if we leverage student agency so that they are owning where they are relative to the attributes, like at the beginning of the year, and making some cognitive decisions based on where they think they are, based on what they've taught, what they learned, and what they understand. That's been helpful. And the other piece is this sense of cross-cultural competence, and students have a real sense of who has access to what experience, and that has been really eye-opening for us.
mm. Thank you for sharing. I think, as the assessment person, we don't necessarily have to think about assessments as sit down and, either like type out the answer or select an answer as a test. Assessments can be done in the classroom through observation, through activities, through other methods that you can get. For example, persistence. And it's not something that can be measured at one point in time. You can look at it
Hmm.
throughout a semester or throughout the academic year and have multiple points. In fact, that gives you a more reliable measure of whatever you're trying to be assessing.
Sure.
So yeah, so not necessarily thinking about measuring things as a test, but through other methodologies. Thank you both so much. We have about 15 minutes for questions, so I'm going to go into the audience questions. And let's see. There was a question about, let me see, how might an online school do this? That's very interesting. Any idea about how an online institution might implement Portrait of a Graduate if that differs from a regular, in classroom brick and mortar type of school?
So and John, you can jump right in. I don't want to monopolize the discussion. We have probably 1,100 students who um, learn virtually full time. 100% of their instruction is 100% virtual. We have a program in Virginia called Virtual Virginia, um, and those students are still connected to their home school. So, for example, with our actualizing the graduate profile, a lot of that work focuses on SEL and curating works of substance and providing opportunities for students to have support. And we still allow that to happen through our school-based counselors and having them have opportunities to work directly with students to work on some of the attributes that are associated with the graduate profile, um, especially as it relates to um, the personally and socially responsible
Mm.
piece.
John, thoughts about doing this online?
I think to the question about virtual, I think one of the great things, and this is actually getting a bit of another question I saw in the chat. The standard, how do you avoid standardization? Is that a portrait is a wonderful, I think, magical thing in a way, in that it allows students to really pursue their own interest to show mastery, but doesn't require everyone to pursue the same pathway to show mastery. So one student could show critical thinking in Algebra 2. Another student might go out and do a work-based learning experience, and they could also use that to show critical thinking. And I think the same applies to online education. What we will often say is that you can do 100% technology oriented, competency-based personalized learning built around a portrait of a graduate. You can also do it where there is zero technology involved. So I think there's lots of experiences and examples where you can operationalize a portrait, essentially using any kind of education model that you're working under. So virtual, in-person, hybrid. I would venture to say there's no one right way to do it. You can do it whatever school model you're using.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. There are a couple of questions that are around the same theme in terms of how the portrait will evolve, pitfalls of standardization, how can one do this in a summative assessment. I was actually working on a paper earlier this week talking about this idea of standardization and summative. Those terms are often used to mean the same thing, but that's not necessarily the case. So, a standardized assessment doesn't necessarily have to mean high stakes multiple choice tests. Standardized just means that kids are seeing things consistently so as an example, you could put together an activity that's classroom and have a rubric that the teachers use to measure students' work. And this, in a way, is a standardized assessment because every student is basically seeing the same version of the project, the task, the activity, and the rubric that's being used to assess them is the same one. It's not like every teacher is making their own rubric. So, in that way, standardized assessments don't necessarily have to mean summative. Um, Good question in terms of how to measure this in a summative setting. I You could just simply add items that, measure critical thinking, problem solving, etc., onto the end of year summative assessment somewhere. But that's not the practice that we are seeing. And what I'm recommending and proposing, and I think as well as the panel, right, is a way that you can embed this into a classroom to look through observation, um, and in a way that is consistent across classrooms in a district, so that if teacher A gives the student observing grit and persistence, a score of 5, that score of 5 is using the same instrument to measure persistence and grit as teacher in classroom B. Other thoughts about assessments and standardization of this from John or Dr. Rogers?
And I think looking at the state level, there's certain requirements that states have to meet when it comes to summative assessments. But I think one of the realities is that there is still a lot of flexibility that local and even classroom level educators can leverage in terms of thinking about a more balanced set of assessments. So for examples of what that might look like, you could still have a summative assessment, but perhaps that summative assessment incorporates something like a portrait of a learner that leads into, let's say, a graduation requirement around a portfolio that exemplifies portrait of a learner characteristics. Or you could even have performance tasks that are embedded throughout the year, or interim assessments that are aligned with the state assessment that also assess those deeper learning skills. So I think the goal with that more balanced assessment system is it frees up and creates more opportunities for those more meaningful low types of classroom level assessments, while still making sure that folks have the same information at the policy at the state and federal level that are required.
Great, I
Yeah. So
agree. Thank you.
the one thing that I will add relative to assessments in terms of how do you measure, one of the questions was, what do we call? All of our teachers are not replacing their end of year assessments with curated works of substance. We're not there, with all of our teachers. Of course, we have quite a few. There are a few different entry points for curated works of substance where you have the opportunity to um, use, I see, capstone class-based projects. Yes, you have an opportunity to take projects that utilize rubrics, or providing students choice in different ways in which they can demonstrate mastery of whatever it is that they were learning. But so, for example, um, one of the things that we do is we ensure that there are substantive, rigorous, real-world work in all of our classroom. Now, that's a standard, and that's an entry point from the curriculum and instruction standpoint. We do provide basic opportunities for our teachers, especially at the elementary level, um, to generate lessons and activities, and then they're curating artifacts in classrooms, and those things are stored in a Google Drive folder, and we have uh, opportunities for students to be able to clearly identify what attribute are they demonstrating here with this particular specific learning artifact. One of my favorite is having the opportunity to share a learning through student-led conferencing or exhibitions of learning or some kind of presentation of learning where students have the opportunity to really talk about what they've learned and what they've done, and that is a fantastic level. One of the things that we're um, still not necessarily challenged with, it's evolving, is this portfolio collection, and John alluded to that, but we are utilizing Google Slides to be able to have students to curate um, their artifacts and demonstrate or showcase mastery and or growth through their portfolio collection there. And then, of course, um, we spend a lot of time professional learning with our staff in order to get them to think about different ways in which they curate student works of substance. Yeah.
Hmm. Very good. There's a question that's, I think, most likely for John because you have multiple state, multiple district perspective. But basically, how many statements do most schools or districts have with respect to putting together a portrait of a graduate? And like, how many is too many? How many is too few? Is there a range, an average that you can share?
I think generally, I believe what we see is that 5 or 6 qualities is typically in what we see in a lot of portraits. Now, not to say that that is a definitive number by any means. You can have more, you can have less. I think the key elements that I highlighted at the beginning that we really emphasize that are important components of a portrait are that it's community created, it's co-created, everyone understands their place in it, and I would venture to say that would be even more important, that everyone is in agreement of what should be included. And perhaps if you have to go 1 or 2 qualities above that 5 or 6 level to really get that community consensus and buy-in, I think that is potentially more important than a specific number.
Mm.
But that would be kind of my general short answer and long answer.
Thank you. Dr. Rogers, did you have any comments about how many statements? How did, Virginia Beach come up with what you had?
So, full truth and disclosure, I was not in the division. I've only been in Division 5 years. So when I got here, it was really just kind of um, that piece had already been decided. And through our work with Battelle for Kids and looking at and having an opportunity to serve on different committees with lots of other school divisions. And John is right. Generally you see, anywhere from 5 to 8. I think any more than 8 is a lot. Um, and I can't remember how many the International Baccalaureate has with their learner profile. But I mean, it's yeah, anywhere from 5 to 8 is. I don't remember seeing many more than that. Because I think after that you start get a little bit of duplication. I think in terms of um, themes and
Yeah,
ideas.
constructs, right.
Yeah.
Thank you. So, believe it or not, we are almost out of time. This hour went by so fast. We really appreciate everyone's participation into the webinar today. We hope you learned a lot. A big thank you to the panelists for sharing their expertise on this. And we want to thank you for attending today. And oh, the camera's working. And the work that you do each and every day for your
Yeah,
students.
I have to turn it off. It's a bad, not a great connection. I just wanted to wait.
and we want to, we're here to support you. And if anyone is interested in performance-based assessments and measuring higher order skills, particularly that are part of Portrait of a Graduate, you can contact us. If you learn more about the CCRA or customized assessments, please reach out. And we hope that you come back soon. Thank you so much again for your time. Have a wonderful day.